It really is an important session because this is the one I think where we're going to be discussing the nitty and indeed the gritty, which is a nuts and bolts session, much more than perhaps we've been talking about up to now, although we have indeed talked of some nitty and indeed gritty already. But we're going to be looking at how you might put a PBR project together, how you construct a commercial model that will drive the innovation that we've been hearing so much about just now, and to offer nothing less than quite brilliant insight and exemplary attention to detail, we have another panel. I don't need to tell you that it is, of course, first class. To my far right, we have Sarah Billiald, who's the Chief Executive of Kent Probation Trust and the Communication Lead for Probation's Chiefs Association. Indeed, she featured in a report of mine not so long ago, so thank you for that. Adrian Brown is a principal at Boston Consulting Group, where he's a core member of their public sector practice. He's worked extensively on the design and implementation of PBR mechanisms in justice. He's also a specialist in social investment, working closely with Big Society Capital. To my immediate left, Gareth Davis, you may recognise, Executive Director and Chief Economist in the Cabinet Office, responsible for civil society innovation and analysis, and over the last decade has worked as the Prime Minister's advisor on welfare reform and has been head of the PM Strategy Unit. And Max Chambers is still the head of Crime and Justice at Policy Exchange. If you haven't read his thing yet, you really must. It is fantastically written and well laid out. And we're going to just sort of this is more of a sort of conversational end-of-day session, so it's not sort of grand speeches. But Sarah Billiald, I wondered if you could offer your kind of reflections on what we've been hearing, not just from the Secretary of State just now, but across the whole day, and indeed, you know, what you think the sort of huge challenges going forward are.
Okay. One of the things that's really struck me today is that there's been very little mention of leadership. And as somebody who would count themselves as a leader in the current system, I think that is going to be critical. You heard the Secretary of State talk about how actually many of the people currently in the system now will still be delivering the system when whatever change it is eventually takes place in something approximating 2 years' time. And actually the leadership challenge over the next 2 years and beyond is going to be massive, and there is a risk that if not more attention is given to that, it could undermine everything. And this morning when we heard from the prison panel about what is it that is making the difference between these prisons that are focusing on rehabilitation and those that aren't, and they said, well, it's not money and it's not whether it's private or public. My view is that it's leadership, and so I do think this is really critical. But if you think about the difficult position that many probation chiefs currently find themselves in, they are both leading an organisation, some would call it a business, some wouldn't, and having to deliver the orders of the court, public protection, reducing reoffending, during a very difficult time of transition. They are also trying to support civil servants to design these policies in a way that is most effective. But they are also a highly pragmatic group of individuals who realise that the majority, potentially, of their current operations are going to be outside of the public sector within 2 years, and they want to do the right thing by staff, offenders, partners, in making sure that the transition is as seamless and de-risked as possible.
Just to really interrupt for a second. I mean, in terms of morale, I mean, just how does the service view what's about to happen? Do they feel this is great, we're going to be part of an exciting new future, or do they feel that basically they're seeing their whole mission taken away from them?
I mean, it does vary in terms of level of the organisation and a section of the organisation. So maybe for senior leaders, such as in Kent Probation, where we've been doing a lot of work over the last 2 years about potentially spinning out part of our organisation, but haven't been able to do so, there is the sense in which there is some opportunity in the current proposals. But for the majority of staff, frontline staff, the level of uncertainty and the scale of pace of change is just not something they are able to get their heads round. And I think creating a narrative around the changes and where people might see themselves in the new world is really important.
Well, not least because they are going to be the leaders very often, or certainly key participants in making this thing work.
Absolutely, and like all previous commentators, we need all the skill sets of the different sectors to work together, and if one core group of them are totally disenfranchised and demoralised, that isn't going to work. So it's very boring and processy, but actually how we manage these changes is more important than the actual changes themselves.
And Adrian, when you're putting together, and it seems to me that lawyers are going to be the key to this in the end, like most things in life, and it's going to be about the nature of the contract, isn't it? I mean,
I think so.
All the things that the minister wants, all the things that all the different groups that we've heard from this podium today have said, comes down in the end to really brilliant bit of contracting.
Yeah, I'd say lawyers and management consultants as well.
Yeah, sorry. The world needs more of those.
I think, yeah, if I was to pick up on one thing that the Secretary of State just said, I think he is painting quite a rosy picture of the work programme, which many would say there were a lot of mistakes in those contracts, which if they had been addressed better during the procurement process, we wouldn't have seen some of the difficulties we've got now. So to be a bit geeky and a bit technical about this, when you're designing a payment by results contract, there are a few things you absolutely need to get right. You need to get the metric right, as we have discussed at quite some length. You need to get the baseline right, which hasn't come up today, which is what does performance look like if you aren't offering payment by results, and therefore how do we know if someone's improved? I think they got that wrong in the work programme. And you also need to pay the right price.
On the work programme, because famously you'd have done better doing nothing, but then of course the forecasts were made in a very different economic climate. Do you think that actually the work programme is failing, or do you think that actually it's only failing on its own rather ludicrous terms?
Well, the work programme is structured differently to the way these reforms are being proposed, in the sense that it pays for every job outcome, even up to the point at which you would expect job outcomes to be occurring anyway, whereas I think these reforms are likely to only pay above a certain baseline, but still agreeing what that baseline is not a straightforward task at all, especially when all of these other reforms are going on at the same time. You've got PCCs, you've got just the outsourcing process itself, you've got changes in technology such as tagging. Taking all of those into account, how will you know what performance would look like if you were not offering PBR, which is the question you have to ask yourself if you're going to baseline one of these contracts. So I have to say I'm an enthusiast and optimist about payment by results, but I would say there's a risk, especially if there's a sort of easy political line, which is if we're only paying for success, what can go wrong? Well, actually a lot can go wrong, and you do need to think about the details at quite a specific level. It's not, I don't think it is as easy as the Secretary of State just suggested, as sort of, it's, I can't remember the phrase he used, but it's child's play, effectively. It's not rocket science. It actually is.
My least favourite phrase.
I think it is a little bit of rocket science required here to actually make this work.
Okay, Gareth Davis.
I'll challenge that actually in terms of not about the rocket science. Being a physicist, I couldn't comment on that. I think I'd comment more though on the idea is getting the contract right is a critical thing. I mean, obviously it is, and that's necessary, but I don't think it's sufficient. I think that's frankly been some of the dangers of working in government in the past in terms of some of these large-scale procurements, either on paying by results or more of the sort of big, heavy lifting contracts. There's a real sense sometimes in Whitehall of sort of, build it and they will come, and we sort of stick these big contracts out there and frankly expect you guys to respond and bid for them. I don't think that's always the case. I think there's a big role in government, big role on the civil servants actually to develop a new set of skills, which is much more around, you can call it market stewardship, you can call it market making, but frankly much more proactive engagement with providers, whatever sector they might be in, and the finance community, to try and think about what sort of package of deals is going to happen. Because I think we sort of underestimate the sense that most markets do sort of work on their own basis, but we're a monopoly buyer effectively. Yeah. And so,
how do you make that? What do you mean by that?
So making it more specific. I mean, there's some things we've been working on with the Ministry of Justice over the last year, partly around sort of bringing people together from different sectors. A lot of you guys know each other anyway, but not everyone does. Especially some of the smaller charities, frankly, aren't used to maybe doing deals with someone like Serco, Sodexo, and the like. So part of it is a bit of what we call deal making or matchmaking, to stretch the sort of dating analogy. Part of it is around providing technical advice. Secretary of State talked about, frankly, some charities needing, to increase their commercial skills. I think I'd agree with that, and I think a lot of the big charities would certainly agree with that. We're funding for some of the work in the Cabinet Office now what we call a series of masterclasses, where you're getting some of the big private sector providers, some of the big charities, people who've won contracts in the past, helping smaller guys to work out what they need to do to be effective, so they're not bid candy. So they know what it means to be part of a contract. So they know what sort of risk they're getting into. They know what sort of requirements they should be putting on the deal. Partly then it's around some technical...
Do you think at the moment, is there enough ground preparation at the moment? We're moving very fast, aren't we?
Yeah, it is moving fast. There's always that trade-off, frankly, around pace and surety. I think it's... I would say, and since it's the feedback, in my role of responsible for the Office of Civil Society, I'm getting incredibly positive feedback from the charity, social enterprise, mutual sector around the work that's going on in the build-up to this contract. Lots of concerns around pace, but lots of comfort around sort of support in place. If that's wrong, I'd be interested to get reviews from the audience where I'm sort of being too confident on that. Okay. But I do think this is an important role for Whitehall, so that's why I think the contract's necessary, but not sufficient. I think there's a role for Whitehall playing both sides.
Max, from everything you've heard during the course, it's been a fascinating day. But what do you pick out in terms of actually the practicalities of making this happen in the time?
Well, I suppose following on from what Gareth just said in terms of market design and stewardship, obviously the Commissioner gets to decide what this market looks like. But I suppose my slight concern is that there's 3 months now where the market sort of and investors in the charitable sector sort of running around, coming to conferences like this and talking to each other without knowing what they're making deals about or what necessarily they're having conversations about. So I think there is a kind of pace trade-off, but I think as well, I think it would be helpful to understand exactly what the competition strategy is likely to look like now, so that the parameters of the market aren't set before the MOJ actually makes decisions about how they'd like things to be structured.
Now, just on the metrics thing, we obviously talked about binary versus, and the Secretary of State was quite honest. I think, he wants broadly something binary, but obviously it's got to be a bit more sophisticated than that. Is that good enough, though? For exactly the reason that you're saying, in terms of people actually engaging, thinking, what would this look like? How can we make a model work?
Well, I think the problem with the binary measure is not only that it incentivises the parking and the creaming that people have talked about today, but actually it drives a cliff edge commercial model. And for me, when I worked for a provider, it impacted on market confidence as well, because most of the studies, first session was on evidence, most of the studies around the world in terms of reducing reoffending don't look at things from a binary point of view. They look at things from a frequency of rearrest or frequency of reconviction point of view. So I think, as well as from the kind of evidential point of view and the politics point of view, in terms of doubts about the integrity of the social impact of a binary measure, I think there are commercial consequences as well. So, we've stated our view very clearly about what we think about this measure, and I think my personal view is that the government will have to make a concession in this area in order to build the kind of market confidence that they're going to need.
There was a hint of that, frankly,
yeah.
What they were saying. And Sarah, in terms of your sense of the sector, how kind of, how aware it is of where the parameter is going to be or not, can you use the next 3 months in a sort of preparing the ground where, as Gareth described?
No, without the knowledge of any of the parameters, and effectively the next 2 months are, well, at best, dead time, at worst, just time for staff to get more and more anxious. And just building on the market stewardship points, it's quite ironic, really, that in this new market, the Secretary of State wants to see these collaborative ventures and joint ventures and mutuals, but on the whole, they don't exist yet. And therefore, when people have been putting in consultation responses, they've been replying as their organisation. So we've put ours in as Kent Probation, not as a potential Kent Probation mutual of the future in joint venture with X, Y and Z. And actually you would answer the questions differently if you are that more collaborative venture. One of the consultation events that I went to that a couple of people hear from, we were in a cross-sector table and we problem solved some of the questions as a cross-sector group, and we came to a different set of solutions by designing it together. But we will have each gone home and wrote our individual consultation responses because that's our duty to our organisation. And I think that it's not just cross-sector co-design, but it's design with the commissioners will be really crucial. And seeing
that can't happen until we know who the commissioners are, can it?
I think it can start to. I think it can start to happen now. And I think probation is not just an organisation; it is a skill set and needs to be seen as part of the provider side as much as part of the new public sector side.
Gareth, 2 months of dead time. It doesn't sound very sensible.
Well, there's an interesting trade-off here about back to pace and about trying to get the design right. It's partly constrained by the normal sort of OG processes, to put that's one constraint. I don't. You're right. A lot of organisations do put a consultation in based on where they are now. But I think that's sort of only part of the picture. We're trying to get a range of different perspectives, be it from yourselves, be it from think tanks, be it from, I'm seeing sort of people from social finance, big society capital in the audience. You start to get different perspectives, and part of the role of the Ministry of Justice now is, frankly, to work the way through that and look at this through different lenses. It's a bit of an iterative process. We'd like to go faster, I'm sure, but it's this is. But it's not. We've got the formal consultations ended. We're always up for new ideas and people to feed in, and shouldn't feel constrained by just necessarily putting them in from the sort of.
But I think the risk is somebody likened it to a game of whack-a-mole. You fix one of the problems for one of the sectors, and another one pops up over there, and you fix that one, and another one pops over there. So I do think it doesn't need to be dead time. It can be about genuine co-design. But I would say that on the whole, probation aren't properly involved with that.
All right, let's take some questions to the floor. The gentleman here, gentleman there. That's handy. Nice. And all the microphones are at the back.
Jonathan Flory, Social Finance. I very much share comments from the panel about too many moving parts and needing to fix some of them down. So my question is, what do you fix first? Is it the size of the retained probation trust and the proportion of the cohort that will be looked after by retained probation? Is that the place to start in terms of fixing some of these elements and allowing the rest of the programme to be built around that?
Okay, we'll take this question as well.
John T. Olive Cooper, I'm the Director of Strategy and Policy.
You sound like a Dalek. What did you say again?
John T. Olive Cooper.
John T, yes, of course.
I'm the Director of Strategy and Policy at A4E. Sarah, I just wanted to ask, I take your point very much about the apprehension that might be building in the service. What sort of things do you think could providers do, or potential co-providers do, now and over the next year to help reassure or allay some of those concerns? What do you think are the most useful things? And a question maybe to Gareth as well, which is, what sort of steps can the centre of government do to help ministries that are already doing payment by results, or may not be, but might be looking to work better together? So I'm thinking employment and justice, for instance, mental health and justice, addiction and justice, so on.
Max, come with you first, actually. What do you think we should be doing first? What's the first thing to fix?
Well, I think the consolidation of trusts makes sense as the first step, and then there's the whole issue about how you make time and facilitate the possible transition of probation staff who want to be involved in the new market based services, and how you facilitate those transitions. And I think there's another kind of point to throw in here around timing, which is that Chris Grayling said that the work programme took a year and a week, and that this might take longer. My other concern is that the longer that this stretches into the middle of 2014, that the more the market's going to start saying, hang on a second, is this really going to happen, or is this going to be reversed by potential change in government? And is this really worth my time and my money? So that's another trade-off that I think we have to think about.
You're advocating going quicker.
Well, I think if you're going to do it, you need to do it quickly, because I think the market confidence point for me is key. And the market doesn't exist at the moment, and people have to believe, and people are a bit bruised, I think, by the experience of the competition strategy from 2010 being reneged on a couple of years later on the prison side. So I think there is a little bit of a feeling of, this has to be seen to be believed. So this is a big market-based reform. You need market confidence to get it through.
Okay. And Sarah, John T's point about sort of apprehensive staff.
Yeah, well, some of it is about knowing the way forward, so that even though we might not like the way forward, we can at least start having a narrative about what that will mean for people, as opposed to, I do Q&A sessions with staff, and they're great and they're really lively, and people have a good old airing of debates, and it's feisty, but it's all questions and no answers, and I'm just saying, good question a lot. One of the things that other mutuals that I've spoken to have advised is for staff members to come and talk to other staff members, not the senior managers who say that it was all lovely and isn't this fabulous, but actually staff members who've gone through the experience of moving to a different organisation, be it a mutual or under 2P regulation, and actually get it from the horse's mouth, warts and all, and that's a very powerful staff engagement tool. So I think some of that, but again, without any parameters at the moment, you don't want to be seen as being preemptive of the possible direction of travel.
Adrian, what would you fix first? What would your order of...
I think we need to be clear what it is we're trying to buy, actually. And I'm not, even after all the discussion we've had, I'm not sure it's entirely clear. I know we've got a very strong theme about the rehabilitation effort and the reducing reoffending, but to pretend that this isn't also a big cost reduction exercise is I think, to be a little bit disingenuous. Obviously, there's a cost challenge across the whole of government, and MOJ is not immune from that, and they will have to take significant...
The Minister was very clear this morning, wasn't he? It was about reoffending. That was the primary overarching aim of this. It's not about saving money.
But I don't really see how, if in a few years' time reoffending's gone down, but the cost hasn't been taken out of the system, how that could be possible. I really don't. So I think we have to be clear that what we're trying to do is both. Actually, I think you sort of challenged him a little bit. I think the answer is it has to be a bit of both, but being exactly clear in what proportions and to what extent we are putting the effort of this contracting process and the PBR onto cost reduction versus reducing reoffending is very important. And at the moment, that's not yet clear, I don't think.
And in terms of the sort of practical business of how you market build, how you create the environment, what should all the organisations here which have an interest in this be doing over the next 60, 100 days?
Well, I mean, as has been said, starting to have the conversations, even if it's in a bit of a vacuum in terms of exactly the details of what's going to be a contract, it can't be a bad thing to start asking the question, well, under these scenarios, how would we deal with this, that or the other, which kind of partnerships do we want to form? But I think it is a fair point to say, until you see the details, until any of the organisations in this room actually understand the nature of this contract, it is quite a difficult conversation to have because you're not quite sure what you're trying to build. So it is going to be speculative until those details are available.
Sure. And Gareth, the lessons from sort of previous payment by results things, what the centre can do at this stage?
Yeah. I want to reflect on that. I think we've seen a series of payment by obviously work programs, one of the largest ones. National Assistance Service is smaller, but has some interesting read across because there's a mix of charitable social enterprises and private sector. And I think there's some quite interesting models there for moving away from prime subcontracting models to some much more consortia based. What we're trying to do in the Cabinet Office, effectively, we're trying to move away from what we might have seen under the previous administration, which is much more the centre telling departments how to do things. Much more around trying to get a sense of sort of, for want of a better phrase, what works, institutions about how to use things like social finance, how to engage effectively with different markets. And back to this point around market stewardship and what that really means, it's not just enough to put the contract out there, but providing in addition some of the technical support and capacity building. The Secretary of State talked about some of the small grants they're making. We're similarly going alongside through things like the Mutual Support Programme, Investment and Contract Readiness Fund, to provide, frankly, grant funding for organisations that want to move away from a position of being inside the public sector to have, frankly, needing some of the business planning, legal skills that they just don't have experience of yet. So I think much more we can do around that. I just come from an event over at Nesta, which launched a series of what works institutions by the Cabinet Secretary. I think there's a lot to be done actually around just really standardising the way in which you go about paying by results contracts. Frankly, they're far harder to do.
Standardising?
Yeah, I think certainly in terms of having some of the core elements.
The Secretary of State, very clear, black box, no, nothing, do what you want to do.
Standardising the way in which Whitehall does pay and by results contracts.
Okay.
Because there's lots of very important trade-offs, partly driven by the economics and what Adrian's saying, what you're trying to buy. There's a danger of every time we do this as a tailored option rather than, frankly, having a little bit more standardisation and off the peg. It's something we're trying to do, for example, we're looking to Jonathan around social impact bonds. You're never going to get it perfectly off the peg, but you can standardise a hell of a lot more. You can get 80% of it.
Do you think the contracts can be standardised?
We can move a hell of a long way in that direction.
And in terms of, there is a tension, isn't there, between central government wanting to say, look, we're not going to dictate to departments, but equally, in this environment, you're talking about health, and obviously mental health is a key one, education, employment and so on. There are different departments involved. Is it not going to take someone perfectly placed in the Cabinet Office to say, let's get these guys in the same room and actually just make sure that we are in the same place on this?
Yeah, I think there's one thing about, say, central government pulling together people and banging heads. It's another thing telling them what exactly to do. I actually think in terms of the real join-up, so you're talking about, say, someone who's unemployed coming straight out of prison, how do you join up the work programme with transforming rehabilitation? I think there's a really interesting question about whether you do that at the sort of the national level, Do you do it for MOJ, DWP, or actually do you do it for the providers? And I wonder, actually, you might get much more better, tailored local solutions when you get local providers stitching together deals. Because they, frankly, have got a much better sense of what's really going on.
Okay, there's more questions. Gentleman there. Anyone else?
Thank you. Tim Roberts-Holmes from Stereo. There seem to be quite a number of revolutions kicking off at the moment. Police and crime commissioners, I felt, was one of them. And I think as a start point, we're all citizens. We all live in communities, be that villages or, let's for the sake of argument, call it a county. And I always saw the police and crime commissioner as the game changer in this, because for the first time we had someone elected who could sit across multiple public services, police, probation, whatever, start to join them up and take some cost out of the horizontal and increase efficiencies that way. And now we have the probation service with what is very much a centrally driven rather than locally driven solution being imposed top down. And yet when I go around the country and talk to probation trusts, and I won't name names or anything, but I get a lot back from them saying, and actually what we want to do is work around our county, the place, with adult social services, children's services, probation, police, and so on, to deliver local solutions for local people, which addresses the challenge in local communities. And I'm just beginning to wonder whether this revolution is not juxtaposing with the Police and Crime Commissioner's revolution, and the Police and Crime Commissioners are actually getting solutions imposed on them that really prevent them from exercising to the full, I think, the extraordinary potential power for change they have with the mandates they've been given.
Okay. Sarah.
I absolutely agree, and I think it's a real risk of these proposals, and it's the one that I've yet to hear a convincing answer to. Russell Webster asked Jeremy Wright this morning about the issue of local disinvestment by other partners if this is not managed well and grounded locally. So, for example, in Kent Probation, our budget's around £20 million, but we have at least £5 million on top of that invested by other people in our offenders to deliver our outcomes. Some through joint commissioning, some through a bit of quid pro quo, and I'll chuck in 10 officers if you chuck in 10 officers and a pint maybe. And it's deals done like that based on relationships built over a long amount of time. And the Minister's answer to this is either it can be built into the contract, and I just don't believe those sort of things can be built into contracts because they're about relationships and they're about time, or, well, the incentives will ensure that this will work. And again, I don't think they will, because I think particularly if you take the police and take something like integrated offender management, we both jointly fund that through the provision of resources. If I, Kent Probation Mutual, suddenly am being paid to provide it, and it's maybe not me, it's somebody else running it, then would the police feel the same about putting that investment in? So I do think that is a massive risk. But again, I come back to my points at the beginning. If we think about how we manage the transition and about that golden thread of probation skills, expertise, and the probation brand, I mean, the public might not know nor care what probation do, but partners do, and it is a very strong brand, and we need that sort of golden thread of probation if we're not going to have sort of local disinvestment, which could end up with people spending less on offenders than they currently do. PCC is critical.
Adrian, what do you think?
Well, if I was to give the sort of PBR answer, I think you have to believe that within PBR the incentives can be necessarily aligned such that providers can work in partnerships, new partnerships or existing partnerships, to reduce reoffending. And I think that was the line from the Minister this morning, was that, well, don't worry, because as long as the incentives are aligned through PBR, we should be fine. I think, I'm not saying that's not possible. I think I go back to my earlier point, which is in order to get those incentives right, you have to think about it quite carefully, because there is quite a strong risk, at least, that you start to put weird incentives, perverse incentives in place for organisations not to work together, or to start to view their partnership working in a very different way, because now there is an outcome that is priced that wasn't priced previously. And that's why, back to that feels quite complicated to me, and that does feel like rocket science. So I think you do need to think about it before you rush in.
Max.
Well, obviously, Policy Exchange we're strong advocates of the PCC reform, and we do think that their role in all of this should be maximised in a way that's sensible and that goes with the grain of where they are, in terms of being quite new. So I suppose, as well as the kind of operational issues in terms of partnership working, I suppose you could also understand why PCCs might feel a little bit miffed at the announcements of the reform slightly cutting across a big part of their brief, big central contracting round and contract package areas that span more than one police force area. So I do think that it should be a key consideration as MOJ goes into another kind of design phase. So for us, I think there's a big role for the PCC in helping to design and specify those local requirements, as well as operationally providing the glue to hold the partnerships together. But could you go further? I mean, could the centre design within the time period contracts that PCCs could commission? I don't know if that's feasible, but certainly could PCCs play a role in the choice of partner? That might not be beyond the realms of possibilities, and I think that would at least give the PCC some ownership over these services, which are going to be in their patch for quite a long period of time.
Would it have been better to have made the contracts PCC based?
Well, I think there are issues around the contracts have to be a certain size for all sorts of things like statistical significance, having the number of prisons within a CPA. So I think there are reasons why it's 16 at the moment, and they have been careful to protect police force areas within that. So there'll be a number of police force areas within a CPA. But I just think there needs to be a bit of thought about how PCCs can be given a bigger role in all of this, given their mandate and given their remit. And I also think that MOJ does a bit of thinking about how actually PCCs could be given greater levers to actually compel local criminal justice agencies to perform as part of the overall package. Because at the moment it's all kind of, we'll get people around a table. They don't actually have a huge amount of performance management or accountability levers to get people around that table.
But if you've got more than one, perhaps 2 or 3 PCCs in an area, and perhaps they don't agree, that's
quite likely. Actually.
Yes, exactly, and that's going to be a bit of a problem, isn't it?
It is, yeah. At the moment, PCCs are beginning to organise slightly around political lines, and not just geographic lines. So it is a risk, and again, it's something that MOJ needs to give quite a lot of thought to, I think.
Okay.
I'll just stand back a minute and look at some of the reforms right way across Whitehall that we've seen since the election. Effectively, what the government's done is create a series of increasingly independent or localised in different ways institutions. You can go to PCCs, you've got these new probation reforms, you look at the reforms on health, increased powers for local government, range of free schools or academies. And the way I sort of see it, and maybe this may not sort of quite satisfy you in terms of the answer, but there's a whole series of now increasingly localised institutions, all with very clear personal mandates, but frankly with overlapping levers. And frankly, I think some of the deals will depend on the local circumstances. So in some areas, you might see the PCCs being very much in the box seat. You might have a really powerful PCC, strong democratic mandate, a strong leadership style, who really, frankly, bang heads together through more informal levers, through more sort of democratic mandate than anything else. In other areas, it may be a really powerful head of a local authority who pulls together the work programme providers with local school networks, try and make things. I just think you'll see a real sense of variable geometry. Maybe I'm not saying it's easy, but also I'm not saying it's working well now. And I frankly don't think I or anyone in the Cabinet Office has really got that local intelligence or knowledge to start to map it all out. We'd love nothing else to have big charts and to work out who should be talking to who. What we do know is when we mandate, they say
do you have a big chart?
Only the weekends I have a very What I really worry about there is that sense that there's a real sense of wanting to design this from the centre. And I think if we look at some of the, frankly, and I think all this is not party political point, some of the failed reforms before, where you've seen things like, say, local strategic partnerships, which forced everyone to sit around the table. When I sat in some of those, everyone talked, but then everyone sort of left, and there wasn't quite always, in the ones I saw, a real clear sense of action. And that's why I think, frankly, letting it push down the power, and then, frankly, work out in different areas who will sort of take the lead on this will be key.
The problem, I think, is partly about the nature of English justice, English and Welsh justice. We can't have postcode justice. So the MOJ has a sort of natural default position of trying to make sure they've got their arms around everything. I remember when I rang up to go and film at the community court in Liverpool, and I rang the community court and they said, we'd love to have you, but you'll have to ring the press office at the MOJ to get permission, who said no, incidentally. And I think that's quite telling, isn't it? Because that's the difficulty for Chris Grayling and Jeremy Wright, is that, you know, they're running a national criminal justice system, and they have to ensure that what happens in Hertfordshire happens in Herefordshire and Hampshire.
Well, I think you've got to separate out here. I think so, yeah, so the justice system is sort of like the court element of this, from the rehabilitation element. But you think you're right. Well, you know, if you're running a big, if you're
justice,
if you're running a big, you know, service, national service, be it in Job Centre Plus, be it in probation, there's a natural tendency to suck up all power and discretion and decision making to the centre. And you see that in the private sector as much as in the public sector. Where I think what's is really interesting here is actually this is about giving more local discretion through the different organisations that will come together and win these contracts. So you might see a bit more, you know, frankly, different styles of interventions. That's what you want. We want to get some innovation coming through here, rather than thinking it's going to be exactly the same in terms of the interventions in every area. Yes, there'll be the sort of court orders, but the way in which we'll support people to stop reoffending will be very different, and that's the only way we're going to learn.
Okay. Any more questions for Paul? Yeah, gentleman there. It's our last chance, I think. Oh, and gentleman over there. Yep, those two.
Thank you. Nigel Bell from Hewlett Packard. Without wanting to get everyone rushing for the door, it's not an IT question. I'm a little bit concerned about the information flows in here. Just picking up on Gareth's point, it sounds to me as though an offender might touch many more organisations potentially in this new world than they have in the past, and that the information following them around could become more and more fragmented. I certainly have an image of a lot of the maybe the smaller charities, smaller organisations, having to re-key information from one system to another as various people, as an offender touches a number of organisations. I wouldn't suggest the alternative is a national system. I was involved in the NHS a long time ago and that didn't work, and others have seemed to fail as well. I don't know what the answer is, though, to this multiple parties being involved, increasing localism, and yet the need for the individual at the centre of this, the offender, to have a one picture built up around them, that information not being too fragmented. Any
we'll take the other question at the same time, and of course offenders do move sometimes as well. Yeah, gentleman there.
Tony Wilson from Inclusion. It's just picking up on Gareth's point about kind of more supporting organisations to make more deals locally and to make things work locally. I think that's absolutely right as an aspiration. I think where we've got a challenge is around making sure that organisations and local leaders have the capability and the capacity to do that. There's a number of different organisations that could play that role. Also that there's access to the finance to do it, which comes back to some of the points that have been made around where I do think, you know, there's a real opportunity and a challenge around how we finance the social sector in particular. But thirdly, that we do commission intelligently. And I think, picking up on Adrian's point, I mean, I think he's absolutely right. There are a number of issues with how, for example, the work programme was commissioned, and it wasn't commissioned over a year. In practice, it was commissioned over 3 months between Christmas Eve in 2010 and spring 2011, which was the key time when the ITT was out and when people had to construct their bids, and making sure that we actually don't write in things that we subsequently come to regret is critical. And the work programme, again, is a good example, because one of the things that does stand in the way of partnership working is that participants are allocated randomly to a provider. So you have to make, in London, for example, you have to make 3 deals, not 1, if you want to make sure that you're getting, you know, the through the gate support the way that you want it. The skills system, I mean, you could go on, but the skills system, for example, you know, doesn't align particularly well with the employment systems nor the criminal justice systems. Making sure that colleges are incentivised and expected actually to meet those needs and wider community needs is really important. So I think making sure that maybe part of the answer is your kind of more common principles in how we do PBR commissioning, but making sure we commission intelligently, we build capability, and we ensure there's access to finance is going to be critical.
Okay, thanks very much. Sarah, do you want to pick up on the sort of fragmented nature of potentially of the future with its information, and how are you going to keep track of perhaps an offender who's, you know, jailed in Leeds, lives in Manchester, and then decides to move to
I guess at a very simplistic level, not IT not being my strong point, you know, there are systems that other providers will have to have access to. I think it gets even more complicated when you think about the wider partnership landscape. If I look at the sort of information sharing protocols that we have to have with the police and the different level of security checks for access to their system. So I think those conversations need to not just take place in consideration of the future 16 contract area providers, but the partnership providers as well, because I have to say, at a local level, it takes a lot of time to try and crack those issues. And I guess it could be much worse, or there is an opportunity now to try and crack those. But it's access to GSI, really basic thing, but it undermines so much of what we already try to do with some third sector providers.
And in terms of the other side of that, in a sense, is the idea of sort of local deals. We're coming back to where you began, in a way, talking about local leaders and the importance of them having the skills and the access to finance. What do you like to see happen?
I suppose there's. I had 5 things that I'd like to see happen.
Go on, let's have them.
I normally have 3, but sorry,
Five.
5. First, we've already touched on policy, objective clarity and honesty about that policy objective. I, like you, don't believe it's just about reducing reoffending, because if it was, you'd have a frequency measure, and that clearly isn't on the table. So if it's about reoffending and cost, let's be clear in what proportion, because it will be impossible for the market to respond. Support for probation leadership now and during transition, which could take a variety of forms. I do think this co-design phase over the next couple of months of cross-sector people will both help the solution, but also the relationships and therefore the transition. Treating probation as a skill set and not just a set of organisations, and therefore as a group of people who will be on the provider side. So therefore considering each of the consultation questions as provider side provision. That's what I'd like to see.
5? Yes,
that was 5.
Very good. Thank you. Adrian. Sorry, do you want me to tell you what you were... there's the fragmentation, the difficulty of actually just keeping track of it, and whether there's a tension between having a sort of centralised national system and then how you make deals locally.
So on the sort of information flow side, I think it is a challenge. I guess the work programme shows us how that can be done to some extent, but doesn't have the same requirements in terms of security, etc. So I don't doubt that solutions can be developed. It's just, can they be developed quickly enough and in a way that is flexible enough so that the right sort of groups of people can come together around solving it for the individual. Just to pick on the financing point, I think there is a tendency to think of social investors and social finance as being willing to kind of step in and finance the voluntary sector when mainstream finance is unwilling. And to some extent that's true, but we can't rely on them as sort of the dumb money that's going to come in and fund deals that are just basically unfinanceable. So, regardless of what you think about social investment, the sort of basics of the deal in terms of the price that's being paid and the returns that are being generated for the risks that are being taken has to stack up, whether you're a social investor or not. So I think that we can't rely on sort of the social investors to ride in on their white horses and kind of pay for risk that other people aren't going to pay for, just to prop up the charity sector as part of this deal. And then the third point I'd make is around commissioning intelligently. It's as much about helping people strike intelligent deals with the primes, which I think the Minister did talk about this morning, because there was a sense that, well, if you sign up for a stupid deal, then that's kind of your fault. It's not quite like that. I think we do need to help. Payment by results especially is complicated, and it requires quite a lot of thought to understand the risks you're taking on. So giving the sector as much help as possible, and that includes mutuals and anybody else who's coming to the table, to really understand the deals they're signing up to, if they are getting into contracting arrangements with primes, will be necessary in order to make sure that the supply chains for these things are going to work in the long run.
Gareth?
I think I'd agree with all of that, to be honest. I think there's 2 points I'll make. Firstly, on the prime subs, I think I'd like to see more around consortia. I'm really interested in sort of rather moving away from the idea that it's only the private sector who can be in the box seat because they've got management skills. I'm not sure that's true. I mean, not sure why it should be. As you say, probation's a skill. So in many ways, that's a scarce resource. So why isn't probation in the box seat and then bringing in private sector people who can then manage sort of the...
Could you imagine, I mean, this is something we haven't really touched on. I mean, NACRO. Why couldn't NACRO be a prime?
Why not? Yeah, completely. I completely.
Have they got the finance? Have they got the?
And I think partly, well, then you can sort of sit. I suppose the question on that, lots of different people will be bringing things to the table in any of these deals. Some people will be bringing knowledge around skills around how to work in this area. Other people will be bringing the finance. Other people will be bringing, if you like, some more commercial savvy. I think it's less around that sort of prime subs as much more as that like consortia. I can quite imagine.
Maybe not in the message. I mean,
it's interesting.
I very much get the model of a big company comes in, is the prime, and then works with subs. We've heard very little from ministers about consortia.
Yeah, I take that back then. I certainly don't see that. I mean, we're very interested in the idea of social sector, primes, different forms of consortia with leaders. I don't see there's any, a priori reason why a prime needs to be private sector. Certainly, you can see that structured in different ways. Just a final sort of challenge back on this sort of social investment point. I agree the deal has got to be structured in the right way. Social finance isn't just another form of grants. But I think it is a real, I've been involved in big society capital for the last 2 years. And this is a real test for social finance at this stage. This is the big game in town, and frankly, this is the real test for the credibility of social finance around the scale at which they can deploy resources. We know there's lots of people interested in testing. How we structure this is going to be really important.
Okay, Matt.
I suppose final thought, just probably unfair kind of impatience for a bit more clarity. So, there are noises about a social prime and the use of social investment and the use of reforms to really stimulate the growth of that market. There's talk about not just having a conventional prime sub relationship. There's talk about probation mutuals and all the rest of it. And I suppose, and there's also been talk about the huge role the voluntary sector have to play potentially in these reforms, even though they don't play a big role now as part of probation core delivery. I wouldn't say. So I just think it would be useful for the market to actually have a pretty clear steer pretty soon about what the MOJ wants, and then that next sort of 3 months, in terms of structuring conversations, workshops, master classes, whatever it is, people will all know what the end game is and how to get there.
Lucy, do you want to say anything? You've been listening to all of this.
Thank you. Just make the last few comments. I think today has been really interesting. I mean, listening to the debate from through the gate to all the sort of debate on this panel. I do hear the message that actually the Minister of Justice now needs to come out with what are we going to do. I think, Gavin, you touched on it, that actually we do have a process that we have to go through. We've got to analyse all of the responses to the document, get that high-level design, and actually come out to you to say, actually, this is what you're saying. And that does take some time. Sarah is right. We're going to have to go through the next few weeks, or whatever that is, of what will feel like dead time. But that doesn't stop us continuing to support the market, help it shape itself. I think the market will shape itself how the market wants to shape itself. We're going to be working very closely with the Cabinet Office to make sure that we get all the tools and support that the market needs to enable itself to shape itself. I think I did hear the Secretary of State and the Minister talk about partnerships. Both of them have said on a number of occasions that they don't want just the big primes and deep supply chains. That doesn't mean they don't work, but actually it'd be really interesting if we had a sort of diverse range of people coming to the table. We talk about primes sort of as that sort of one word. It's a partnership of individual organisations coming in. Some will take the risk, some will have the real skills of delivery, and together they make that perfect partnership picture that I think the department's looking for.
But just to be clear, because there's the model of the prime and then the subs, they can be in partnership and it's all happy, but you're saying that you would be interested in seeing a prime come forward, which was a consortium of organisations, which included perhaps the voluntary sector, perhaps some social enterprises and so on.
Well, yeah, we'd be very interested in any type of consortium that would come through. The Secretary of State specifically talked about, or I think it was either him or the Minister, talking about a partnership of organisations coming to the table. That could include a number of different organisations.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much indeed for that. I think it's been a really fascinating day. Well done to Policy Exchange, well done to all the sponsors and to Deloitte for having us. It's been brilliant, I think, just in terms of both the big picture, having a fantastic cast. Well done to Policy Exchange for putting it together. And for the moment also, thank you to our excellent panel just now. Thank you very much.